An archipelagic country like the Philippines is rich and is intuitively dependent on its aquatic resources. But how are these resources taken care of in light of ever-advancing technologies as well as disruptions, both natural and man-made? I am Philip Hernandez and welcome to Above the Fold. We are joined today by experts from the Department of Biological Sciences. First up, we have Dr. Jonathan Carlo Briones. Good afternoon, sir. We're also joined by the Department Chair, Dr. Ray Donnie S. Papa. Good afternoon, sir. And finally, we have Dr. Richard Thomas Pavia. Gentlemen, good afternoon and thank you for joining us on Above the Fold. Just to set the context, when we talk about aquatic resources, please talk to us, what these actually entails for a country like the Philippines, and give us a preview a little of your own work in the area.
Being an archipelagic country, it's anything and everything contained in freshwater, in lakes, in rivers, and in the ocean. Anything that can house aquatic organisms belongs to that segment.
Okay, and Sir Richard, your field of expertise in
I'm a marine biologist and I focus mostly on coral reef ecology.
Coral reef ecology. Yes, Sir Ray, how about you?
I'm the one who studies the lakes in the Philippines. So the discipline is called limnology. So I particularly focus on studying the zooplankton in terms of its biodiversity and ecology in the different lakes that we have here in the Philippines.
Okay. Sir Jonathan.
Yeah, for me, actually, I think we're all in agreement with regards to the meaning of aquatic resources. It really is all resources, whether it be in moving water, inland water, or in the oceans. My particular field is also related to them. It's mainly fish biology, in particularly parasitology.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So what's the current state of the different resources that we have here in the Philippines? With all the issues around like climate change and all, increased commercialization, and even, if I got it right, the creation of artificial lands coming on places where there were used to be water. So what's the current state, I mean, in your assessment?
Well, at least for the marine resources of the Philippines, we are lucky enough to be in a very unique biogeographical area with the supposed high biodiversity. But overfishing of fish and other marine aquatic organisms, development of land like you mentioned. There are still some pockets of pristine habitat, but most of them are affected by development and industrialization. And of course, lack of proper management is one problem.
Overexploitation is always a big issue. And all the other sub-problems arise mainly from overexploitation. So for freshwater resources, it would be excessive nutrient inputs into the systems that actually promote algal blooms and cascading effect on the rest of the ecological processes that take place in these freshwater bodies. Apart from that, the demand for their use for aquaculture, specifically when it is already on the unregulated or underregulated use of these inland water bodies for aquaculture, that have a detrimental effect on the biodiversity of these aquatic ecosystems.
Okay. In terms of our regulations, where are we? Sir JC, perhaps you can enlighten us on this.
I think in terms of regulation, there are so many laws that are in place. And I think that in terms of the strength of the laws, it's as strong as those found in other countries.
Okay.
The only problem really is strong implementation. Okay. If we really just follow what's in the laws themselves, strict implementation, there wouldn't be much of a problem. We wouldn't be in much of a problem that we are right now.
Okay. So, to the regular Filipino, are we in a crisis, or what will these problems now result in that will have a direct impact on Filipinos? Sir Richard.
For marine concerns, we are not yet in a crisis situation, but we're on the cusp of a crisis situation. If you go to the market now, the only things we notice are fish prices are getting expensive. The sizes of the fish are getting smaller. But what people don't realize is once the system gives up or collapses, when fish stocks run out, when climate change sets in and things are already happening, like coral reefs are dying, recovery rates are very slow or non-existent. So I'm thinking if nothing's done for in the next 10 to 15 years, then we're going to feel the effects of that crisis.
In terms of fresh water, do we have...
Basically, the same problems would be found, though. Except that for freshwater, you have the added problem of exposure to invasive species would be much more of a threat for freshwaters compared to marine organisms, no? Because there are so many possible routes of introduction, and when they get introduced into these, for instance, in lakes, so these are closed ecosystems, no, and they do damage to the local freshwater flora and fauna there, then you would have detrimental effects, no, meaning that the introduced species can outgrow and overcompete or outcompete the native ones, and this would mean a loss of biodiversity. Couple that with the fact that we barely know the biodiversity of these areas. So what happens often is that we lose them even before we get to know them.
I see. Just to add further context, perhaps here in the metropolis, one of the most recognizable aquatic resources we have, am I right, is the Pasig River.
Yes.
And for the longest time, it has been touted as a dead river. Can aquatic resources which were called dead, if that's even the right term, recover? And how long does this process take? What needs to be done if ever we're to recover?
Essentially, when you say that the river is dead, I mean, it's still alive in a way, but in a way that is not in its most pristine state. But I do believe that with human effort, it can be turned around, but it has to be scientifically managed.
Yeah, if I may share, no, actually, we've seen cases in other countries wherein lakes and rivers which used to be in a very bad state, no, sometimes even worse than Pasig River and Laguna de Bay, have been restored, no, meaning if they were heavily eutrophied, meaning a lot of nutrient inputs were brought into a lake, they would stop the nutrient inflows. And then they would have very efficient water treatment facilities put in so that all future inputs into the lake or river system would actually be of much cleaner water. And then they would put in some other measurements, no, that would ensure that these rivers or lakes would recover. But of course, you're talking here of a time frame of around half a century before the positive impacts would actually be felt. But take note that these are developed countries wherein discipline and even zoning, no, of populations were highly regulated. But in the case of the Philippines, of course, we know that that's not the case. And so this compounds to the problem that we already have. No, instead of us finding solutions how to decrease the nutrient inputs into these aquatic ecosystems, what we're happening is that we're just in the phase that we're studying the impacts because they continue to happen. No mitigation measures have been successfully put in that really put a decrease, no, into the amount of nutrients or other pollutants for that matter that come into an aquatic ecosystem in the country.
So it's really an issue of implementation, discipline, human interventions, and or the lack of proper interventions on the part of human beings to commit to the laws that we actually legislated. Okay, before we close out the first segment, there's been some talk regarding a patch of a body of water that's now ours, and that's the Benham Rice area. Legally, it has been declared it's ours. Okay, and what are the potentials of this new vast area that we have?
One interesting about Benham rice is that if you look at productivity in the oceans, the most productive areas, as they relate to what the population can utilize, would be shallow water areas.
Okay.
Because it can support coral reef growth, it can support a large number of fish species. And that is what Benham rice is. It's an elevation under the sea that reaches just near the surface, where it can serve as an area for the growth of corals and fish. But the problem is, it's close to the Philippines, but not really that close to be constantly monitored. And it takes, when you talk about allocations by the government in terms of research funding, we can't just go there regularly. So it becomes open to utilization by other entities.
Okay.
And we know that in politics, in geography, they who can always utilize a place tend to claim it as theirs. And although legally Benham rice is ours, when you talk about utilization, it seems that other countries benefit more from it than us.
Okay. So for this first segment of the episode of Above the Fold, we've been discussing about the current context of the Philippines' aquatic resources. When we come back, we'll go into more detail about what interventions are available, what courses of action we can take, and the status of these. Above the Fold, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Above the Fold. During the first part of the episode, we were talking about the context of the Philippines in terms of our aquatic resources. And Doc JC, we were mentioning earlier about the kinds of regulations we have. And you said that our regulations are actually okay. In terms of the way they were written, how strong they are, they're okay. But you mentioned that strong implementation is lacking. Can you delve deeper into that? And maybe our colleagues can also chime in as to what regulations are either often neglected or violated.
Actually, in terms of lake conservation, it would be wrong of us to say that the local stakeholders are not doing their job. We work with them very much, people from LLDA, from BIFAR, and usually what they echo is that the reason why they can't do full implementation is because in terms of funding into their own bureaus, funding is very low.
Okay.
So that they could not allocate so much on monitoring and other conservation or regulatory practices. So for example, for Laguna Lake Development Authority, they are responsible for their task to look into the proper implementation of water usage across all of the different provinces surrounding Lugar de Bay. But essentially, in terms of manpower, they're very, very small. So, very, very few people are allotted to a very large place to monitor. So they don't have manpower, they don't have enough funding to be able to do their job well.
This sentiment is echoed in marine resources.
When it comes to conservation of marine resources and the laws that provide guidelines for it, on the municipal level, there's no problem because you have the Bantay Dagat on the barangay level. I've been to many places with marine reserves, and many people are fully conscious and aware of conservation.
Okay.
And municipalities and the areas that they cover are very well protected and very well maintained. But the problem now is areas beyond the limits of the municipal waters, meaning open water but still within the Philippine Economic Zone.
Okay.
The municipality cannot protect it anymore. It's beyond their mandate, and it's now the territory of the Coast Guard.
Okay.
But the thing is, too little is being done about this. I mean, if you watch the news, our own government is allowing foreign fishermen to, with better boats, better equipment, to fully utilize the resources that our country needs. So, in micromanagement, there's no problem. But in the larger scale, on a larger context, it's enforcement. And like the military always says, they need more boats to patrol. That's the greater problem. It's on the level of the government, the higher ups. That's the problem with them. Yes.
Okay. Sir Ray, in your experience.
I'd like to add to that. No, sometimes Filipinos like to go around the laws, no, and find ways by which they can violate the laws without actually violating the laws.
So is it fair to say that we're not trying to hinder commerce, but we're trying to give the lake time to breathe, so to speak?
Precisely.
Okay.
Actually, aquaculture in itself is actually very good, no? Because it provides for fishes that are of lower cost to the public. Now, without aquaculture, the prices of fish would definitely all go up, especially for freshwater fishes. The problem there is if you have irresponsible and underregulated aquaculture practices in these inland waters, instead of doing more good to the economy and to the lake, they would be doing the negative impacts would be overshadowing, no? Whatever positive things that we can get from aquaculture.
So if in the short term we get big bucks, in the long term we might run out of these. Okay. So it's kind of pointing out to moderation.
Yes.
Okay. So moderation, sustainability, right? And what interventions are there to combating climate change and all? What interventions are now being done just to try and ensure survival and sustainability of these resources that we have?
Well, for marine resources, for coral reef ecosystems, like what I'm doing, we all know what's going to happen or what is happening because of climate change. Coral reefs are dying, and it's taking them a longer time to recover. So some of my students have been doing techniques in coral propagation, whether you break them off as fragments, growing them at a faster rate, and then deploying them back, just to ensure faster recovery and ensure that the coral reef grows back to allow continuity.
So
of the
there's human
ecosystem.
intervention now in accelerating the
Yes,
regrowth.
because of climate change in itself, recovery has slowed down, and in some places recovery doesn't occur at all.
How about for UST? We are, in the middle of the most urbanized area in the country. How have we helped other areas in the country in terms of this challenge of, conserving and making our resources survive?
I think one recent event which the university hosted in collaboration with the Philippine Society for Freshwater Science was the Tawilis Summit.
Okay.
I think in one way, the university acts as a gateway, a neutral ground for people to be able to speak their mind.
Okay, so we see now that there are pocket efforts being done, municipal level, city level, at the academe, of course. All right. So when we come back, we'll be talking about the way forward. How will the Philippines now take care of its aquatic resources given the threats, both man-made and natural? Above the Fold, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Above the Fold, and now we'll be discussing the way forward for us to better take care of our aquatic resources. So it was mentioned earlier in the second part of the show that we need a national framework, okay? The academics and the government agencies are singing in unison, so to speak, as to what needs to be done. I mean, there's not much divergence in terms of what your findings are. But if you were to operationalize now how to translate that from the level of individual agencies to a national consciousness, what are the steps that need to be taken? I mean,
The first thing is to take note of what laws are already in place. Because sometimes people think laws need to be made, but they're actually existing already, but they're not just being implemented. We need to look deep inside. We need to look back. What laws are in place already? And we need also to ask, what laws need to be changed? What laws need to be modified? Because there are so many researches that need to be made, but they're not being supported by laws, or sometimes being blocked by laws. You need to do research on this, and then when you go to the government, you say, we need to collect this and start this. They say no, because there's a law that prevents you from doing that. And then the paper trail, the paperwork to allow you to get access to those specimens or to get that procedure done takes a long time. So it needs more of a big sit-down meeting. And people need to be more open-minded, because what, from my personal experience, is the government just says, that's the law, we can't do anything about it. There's no, oh, is that the problem? Let's try to work on it, try to find some leeway. So it needs open minds from both sides and a good long sit down to talk about how the cooperation needs to be made. It can be done, but people just need to take time and find an agreement.
So we're not starting from zero, totally.
Definitely.
We're not starting.
We're like looking at patchworks that just need to be integrated. And once those links can be made, it's going to be very easy from that point.
All right. If we step away a little from the legislative side, what else needs to be taken care of for us to reach that national framework? Apart from just revisiting or fully implementing laws, what else needs to be done?
It's to probably get everybody's insights, no, ideas, because the academics can give. We give our suggestions, of course, based on researches that we have conducted. No, but sometimes we're not really the experts on the ground who see the daily happenings in any particular area. So, in short, constant communication and linking up with the local people who live in a particular area that would be who would be benefiting most or who would be affected most by policies and or rules that are being implemented or are going to be implemented, no, when it comes to aquatic resources should be consulted regularly. And then there should be an openness to one another's suggestions for improvement. Because sometimes if the scientists would be too brash and too harsh about saying that you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, I mean, these are their livelihoods we're talking about. So you should be conscious of that part as well. And as for the locals, they should be open to the fact that science can make them gain more from the natural resources that
In
they
the
are
long run.
in the long run. And so that should be taken into consideration, no? And of course, policymakers, no, local government officials or national government agencies should consider suggestions from these two parties when they are making new policies or laws, because sometimes if they only rely on their advisors, their consultants, no, they could lend you suggestions that would be biased or would only take one point of view, and so it would not be a very holistic way of doing things.
How about for those with commercial interests? Apart from those people on the ground, the locals themselves, of course, they need their livelihood. The bigger players in terms of commercial interests.
I think the bigger players need to have, they need to take a bigger responsibility. So especially in terms of environmental sustainability. There is a mindset wherein people are made to feel guilty that they need to utilize these products in terms of solid waste that goes into our streams and rivers. But the problem is, it is what's available for them. So if these big commercial players make it accessible to the people to be sustainable, then it would actually turn out, it would provide a bigger turnout in terms of environmental conservation, especially with our aquatic resources.
Okay. So you mentioned a little, for example, about waste. No? At the level of a regular Filipino, what are the things that we do that actually end up being detrimental to aquatic resources? And what should we no longer do? If not to totally address the problem, at least not aggravate it. If I may ask each of you gentlemen, one very concrete example of this.
Well, to follow up with regards to the solid waste, one really big problem is plastics use. So single-use plastics. So that's why we were talking about how these big companies permit or encourage the use of sachet single plastics that turn out to go into our streams and rivers. But the problem is these plastics, they don't really degrade. Even when they get cut up into small pieces, they become what we call microplastics. Now, the microplastics, even though they're small, their components are still the same. So that they get eaten by filter feeders, mussels, crustaceans, things that we eat. So I think that came out a few months ago, how a European was eating mussels, and then they analyzed it, and they saw how much of it was actually plastics.
Plastic.
And if we put that into context, the Philippines is still considered the third largest solid waste producer in the world. So you couple that with our natural resources, an archipelagic resource wherein all of our economic gain come from aquatic products, crustaceans, mussels, fish, that may eat these microplastics. So we want to save ourselves. We're not really just saving the environment, we're saving ourselves by not throwing haphazardly these wastes.
Certainly. Thank you, Steve.
For me, clearing our water body, especially those closest to the urban settlements, no, of huge amounts of organic waste that come into these systems. No, unfortunately, this is going to be traced to the problem of informal settlements, no, or improper sewage management, wastewater treatment. And so, if you are an ordinary citizen and you know, for instance, that there's something, your house is not actually designed to store up sewage in a proper way, or you know that you're just dumping your wastes into open bodies of water, no, then you should be more conscious about that. No? And seems so passe, but we say that you should pick up trash when you walk. No, you should stop throwing things. You might think that, well, the plastic problem, of course, is there, and we've seen how bad it is, no, whenever we get huge floods. And so you should be more conscious about how you throw your trash, no? Because whether it be plastics or organic waste that you're dumping irresponsibly, this would have detrimental effects on the aquatic ecosystem, which would then later on have impacts on health, on
Goes
wellness,
back to people.
and goes back to us. So
Yes, sir.
What's unique about the ocean is that even though a person may not be able to see the ocean in his entire lifetime, anything thrown by that person eventually ends up in the sea. Any plastic you throw on the street, chemicals you pour down the sink, even oil that you pour down the storm drain eventually ends up in the sea. I always tell people, just be very conscious of what you throw. And when you buy something, when you use something, make sure it's something that won't add to the pollution. But I always suggest to a person, because some people say, what can I do? I'm just a small person. I'm just a small voice. Who will listen to me? Our voices are very powerful. I always tell people, you see that resort, you know that they reclaimed their land. don't support them or try to influence them. Just voice out your opinion. If you cannot stop something from happening, don't support it. If you know that someone, for example, this fish that's being aquacultured is being grown in the wrong way. They use, for example, too much antibiotics, too much medicine. Then don't support the product. Aside from limiting what we throw away, we should also be conscious about the companies and the people that we're supporting. Because once we send the message across that if you continue polluting, your income will go down, then that's the point they'll start listening. So that's what I can suggest.
This episode of Above the Fold talked about the Philippines' aquatic resources. What we have, what has been done so far, and what still needs to be done. I am Philip Hernandez, and this has been Above the Fold.